Hello everyone, today we talk about the Iphicratean hoplite. We have met in general hoplitism and discussed certain hoplitic types. We made, for example, a video on the lighter one that appeared starting from especially from the Peloponnesian War, to get, say, more differentiated from the rest of the heavier type. Hoplitism is a wide topic because it doesn't, of course, just refer to armament or equipment as always, but it's about the political and social context, right? Even before even the tactical one. And in order to explain the major changes that occurred historically, one always has to stress, first of all, that we don't know too much. Today we will look at essentially the few information that we have about the Iphicratean hoplite, to see that's it, right? We don't have any other other than sometimes iconographic representation, but still not in the way without a tag that doesn't actually tell us what is shown. And as always, it should be very important to read from the original texts and the original lexicon, because sometimes properly the way that certain troops typologies or armament equipment were called do not have a categorical kind of linear encyclopedical specificity per se, right? And so we have to be able to understand what we're talking about. Some these hoplites were, for example, called peltastai, and many people do not distinguish, as it would be banal for every classicist instead, between the peltast, let's say, of the Peloponnesian Wars, that is effectively a skirmisher, and a peltast in the sense, broadly speaking, of in this case a hoplite equipped with a pelt, in fact, and that is another thing. So it's very easy to make the mistakes. So making videos about giving, say, the definitions for what we know and for what we hypothesize sometimes, but still looking at fundamentally all we've got in terms of historical references is very important. So what are we talking about? So Iphicrates, that was the adoptive brother of Philip II of Macedon, coming back from the Persian War of 374 BC, as an Athenian general, reduced the protection of the hoplite in Athens at this point, diminishing the dimension and the weight of the shield, bringing it to something like 50-60 centimeters in diameter, and substituting the bronze cuirass with a padded linen armor. And this change had basically rendered the hoplite more vulnerable, especially against projectiles, against missile. But Iphicrates provided his hoplites with much longer lengths of those in use at that time, from 3.6 meters, according to Diodorus, to 420 for Cornelius Nepos, against the 2.4 meters, or even less, of the traditional hoplitic lengths. Which means that if you consider, at least maybe 40 centimeters of the shaft that were from the side of the hoplite itself, behind his end, the Iphicratean hoplite had roughly 60 centimeters at least of advantage on the other hoplites, and thus could hit them before these could reach a useful distance. Naturally, this doesn't mean, as we explained many times, that having a longer or shorter weapon with all the double senses, the double meanings that you can attach, that actually makes much of a difference, in the sense that we know that these type of lengths that was eventually reaching very close to what the Sarissa, the Macedonian Sarissa would actually equate, and probably inspired, because that's what we think, that the Iphicratean hoplites, albeit being hoplites, and therefore something very different from the Macedonians, the Macedonian phalanges that were part of a combined arms system, and effectively, as Iphicratean hoplites fought just as any other hoplite. And so for an hoplitic formation, as it had been in classical hoplitism, so again, something very different from the Macedonians, indeed may represent, let's say, one of the say, you could argue, I don't like this adjective, but let's say natural evolution towards this, for the necessities that we know in Hellenic warfare, towards essentially a more agile, maneuverable, and quasi-professional system. And that, as you know, but that point, also with the decline of Sparta, the rise of, think about the oblique order by the Thebans, etc., had brought had obviously shown how many resources being triggered and were more available to the Hellenic city-states, and not only to unhinge what had been, and this was even since the Peloponnesian War, but even before, in a certain sense, the traditional hoplitic tactics that could be, in this sense, a matter of other factors. So the length of the spear, in this sense, is something functional to a different type of combat, not necessarily to the fact that that would confer an advantage per se. Just before, as we know, just during the Peloponnesian War, banally the peltasts, the skirmishers, had proven that the hoplite, a heavily armored and a relatively trained one. Let's think about the Spartans, that were a bit the exception of semi-professionalism in Greece, could be taken out simply by less like a light infantryman, a skirmisher, a no one, right? And so even there, for reasons that have to do with the new spaces that the Hellenic warfare had ventured in, right, in battles that were ever more kind of warring, kind of hit and run tactics and strategies, etc., scorched herd, let's say raids, things like these, where the very scarcely maneuverable hoplitic phalanx would have easily been worn out, and going on terrains that were not the ideal ones, were, according to a myth, to an age that might have not even properly existed, like the one of two phalanxes meeting that place in a plain with a perfect phalangitic tactic enabled, which if you search for an Hellenic battle, you don't really actually find. It's more like an idea, like the ones the Greeks were fond of in theory, that in practice were always, like in old warfare, always mitigated and changing. Were no more, and so were terrains such as mountain passes, where the hoplites were obliged to break the phalanx, and therefore the peak of their vulnerability would trigger the use of skirmishers that could hit them and target them in that very vulnerable situation. But the same combined tactics of a greater usage of cavalry, for example, missile troops, different terrains, different peoples, and we know very well how hoplitism was fundamentally never pure, if you can even call it like this, and if it was fundamentally in Athenian and Spartan warfare, or if you look at the rest of the Hellenic motherland, you can see that things began to degrade in that direction, and in the colonies even less. So the idea is that we shouldn't be so surprised of seeing lighter troops in Hellenic warfare, because these had always existed, in a sense, surely in different ways. The hoplitic tactics took really a long time to become the ones that we see by the 5th century, right? And at that point, the things start changing again, and we see in other times, like for example, even from the same Xenophon's memorabilia 528, the conversation between Socrates and Pericles the Younger, so the son of the great Pericles, a witness of the debate that brought to the same reform of introduction of lighter troops in Hellenic warfare in general. Here it's in a form of a dialogue, and Socrates asks, Pericles says, have you noticed, Pericles, that our frontier is protected by great mountains that extend in Boeotia, through which there are steep and narrow passages that lead to our land, and that the hinterland is run by harsh mountains? Certainly. And have have you also heard that the Mysians and the Psadians, occupying a very disconnected ground in the territories of the great king, and equipped lightly, managed to overcome and to damage the territory of the king and to preserve their liberty? Yes, I've heard of it. And don't you think that young and energetic Athenians, more likely armed actually, and settled on the mountains that protect our country, would turn out to be a thorn in the side of for the enemy and a powerful bulwark at the defense of our people? So you see, in a much older time, how already the concept, for example, of the peltas was there, how the idea of a lighter trooper could adapt better to the terrain and kind of oblige certain, even in a sort of guerrilla style, but not. We know from Clausewitz, we looked at mountain warfare, what this meant, and you know that the Hellenic hinterland was quite, normally quite a rough ground. These troops would normally flourish, and especially when warfare was brought on an ever larger scale, where it was fought literally everywhere, these troops notoriously would become more important. So hence the rise of mercenaries. In these times, the prolonged warfare, just that the resources brought by Athens and Sparta historically had, could now unlock, right? Could be employed, having been unlocked in projecting these powers on larger strategic theaters, and so on. So why the Iphicratean reform? We will make a video more specifically about this, but you understand that we know a few in general about what properly from the sources of what this reform consisted in. We'll see a bit better now some consideration, but we can simply quote the two aforementioned authors, Cornelius Nepos from the life of Iphicrates, and Diodorus Siculus, 1544 1-3. So Cornelius Nepos says about Iphicrates, for example, he changed the infantry weapons, and if before that he became commander, the infantry used very large shields, short spears, and small swords. He, on the contrary, exchanged the round shields with the pelta, from which the infantry drew the name of peltasts, right? So not to be confused with the skirmishers in that regard, because the Greeks called normally their units with the name of their shields, quite eloquently. Right, think about the Romans, call them from the name of their weapons. It was about defining, the shield was defining in an Hellenic mentality. Now we can't digress on, but that favored mostly the prefixed order, and this idea of maintaining cohesion at all costs, in a sense, because the relative materialism of warfare had made them reasoning along those patterns. The pelta was brought by, as you know, it's just a name, by the way, so there is nothing specific about it, but there were populations like the Thracians or these other many people. So sometimes you can confuse the pelta with the Tureos, for example, because in the Hellenic world the Tureos was smaller than the one used by the Celts, the Italics, and so even what's the difference with a pelta? That's important to ask, because factually we don't know. It's just a smaller shield. Right here it's something different. It's for heavy infantry. Still, this is not light infantry. This is heavy infantry because it holds the ground, but it's a smaller shield. So much that these troops are not hoplite anymore, in that sense. But peltastai, even though factually they're still hoplites in the sense we attribute it instead from a tactical point of view, not just because of the name of the shield. And the reason Cornelius Nepos says about this change is that the soldiers could move and charge, by the way, more easily and less burden. It's important to stress that hoplitic warfare actually considered a big deal of charging, and we have often thought it's not quite the case. We imagine this kind of because the Reganian hoplitism has taught us something very wrong about that warfare, as the authors of that historiographic branch, let's say, were traumatized by hand-to-hand combat from the Vietnam experience, and so they had to look at ancient Greece as a model also of republicanism and democracy in ways that also properly from the field were confusing, let's say, the Hellenic amateurialism with a lack of physical contact, which was not true. As a matter of fact, every amateur without discipline, the first thing that is able to do is charging straight against the enemy. What professionals do is maintaining cold blood and knowing when to charge and not to do it just because you feel. That's what we constantly get, this deluded with. This the idea that some kind of instinctive warriorism that, such as like one, without discipline, without a higher authority and discipline, has properly some advantage over the latter. This is not the case, and every Hellenic hoplite, doesn't matter how amateur, was obsessed about things like the Iliad, Achilles, this idea of blind, furious violence, like that you could imagine in a kind of a still heroic warfare. That, of course, these people had, as non-professionals, no kind of grasp of, if not this need to go out there and charge and do it. And we have removed that from hoplitic tactics. We just think of these people, always remaining stuck together no matter what, right? And the reason why they did that, and their obsession of that, was actually during the maneuver. That was fundamental for maintaining cohesion in order to get to combat. Because again, without training, the formation could easily break, right? The Spartans, were the Spartans so appreciated, let's say, at least within the Hellenic boundaries? Because they were the only ones that had higher training, and a semi-professional one fundamentally. So there were really nothing special in terms of ancient warfare standards if we look at other peoples fighting elsewhere. But let's say they still they had the capacity to deploy much faster, much more orderly than the other Greeks. But as far as combat is concerned, that is, when the phalanxes properly met, at that point, the idea of compactness is relative. Hoplites did charge like hell in and out the formation, and this depended on the circumstances, of course, but it wasn't absolutely anything strange. And the idea of just the press, with hoplites basically just pushing against each other with the otis moss and no other, remaining firmly stuck, glued together, could happen given the circumstances, but it wouldn't happen always, right? And there were many ways of fighting. And actually, as we will see now, what was enhanced by the Iphicratean reforms was exactly this, if you want, greater individual flexibility, meaning that, being there out there, many more troopers than just hoplites. These hoplites had to adapt even to that situation. They would be in need sometimes properly be engaged ever more frequently into hand-to-hand combat. This is not a contradiction, because the same Spartans that, as we've seen, championed order and discipline in the Hellenic world were also that would invest the most in collective training, were also the ones that invested the most, in case of need, in individual training, as they were factually the only ones who received a formal comprehensive sword training, whereas the other Greeks, that still used the sword and always used it, and that's also, in fact, overlooked about the political tactics, wouldn't, however. As we will see, in fact, now, Cornelius Nepos says, Iphicrates doubled the length of the lances and increased the ones of the swords, right? So this is very important, because you know that this requires, in both cases, both collectively and individually, a greater amount of training, right? If you have a longer length, it's more difficult to make it work collectively if you don't have a higher training, right? And because there are swings, oscillations. You also in order to make that say greater distance at which you fight effective, you have to make the formation functioning more compactly. So here you can see what was happening at the time, by the mid 4th century BC, an increased professionalism in these troops. The same goes for the sword, right? If you have a longer sword, you have essentially something more difficult to use, but at the same time something that reveals that you must have greater training and practice to use it, right? This is the time of the collapse, in a sense, of the citizenry soldiery, right? This is the moment of the rise properly of mercenarism, and you can see that for what also the Macedonian phalanges technically were by themselves, were just mercenaries. They didn't have any other kind of civic feeling or whatever. So also in Greece, mercenarism had increased equally, and it was easy for even small cities to actually buy at a convenient price these troops. And these troops, again, by such standards, were more professional. So you would expect also from the infantry, and we don't know how much the Iphicratean reform actually, let's say, impacted the Hellenic infantries altogether, the various poleis. We don't have a measure for that. As for most things, we don't even know how much the older type of hoplitism remained, and it did remain, right? At least modified, change, but speaking specifically of the equipment that these sources are stressing, Iphicrates, the change, we don't really know, right? We know this started from Athens, but we have no reason to believe that it didn't start from other places either, right? That this was something that just, of course, Athens was a prominent polis as a military power in the Greek world, but this doesn't mean that there wouldn't be actually a more generalized need to change this. In fact, as far as all the great military reforms in history that to whom we attribute all this great deal of genius for having changed this and that, these are, let's say, even with witnesses like, these are also later sources, but let's say the idea that there is a guy that arrives and changes things that nobody had ever thought, right? How many innovations have been attributed to Gaius Marius that we know existed from centuries already in the Roman army? These were armies change independently from their leader. Just the same from great autocratic reformers. The same military practice brings to that. So most of what these reformers actually did was to generalize or standardize or uniform or whatever you want to call it with a due approximations of the terms, practices that were already there, that nobody had maybe ever imposed, homogeneously in a corps, and they that for this reason had never been systematized, for example, by an army that would be quite active in striking a success in through that, a remarkable success through that, through those tactics. And Iphicrates did win important battles for that matter. So that's how historians would pinpoint these individuals in time and say, it's the guy who did that, because it wasn't actually the guy in himself or that came up with the idea. The idea was already there. More or less everybody knew that. It's just that nobody had ever brought that to a uniform consequence and to a large enough scale for it to be deemed to be relevant in a systematic sense, right? In a systemic sense, at least. Right, and in fact, again, we don't know how much of the same Athenian armed forces were equipped like this. But still, some people say, we don't even know whether this was for the army or the navy or some. But this is actually not. I believe there is not much of a problem to determine. This is obviously about the heavy infantry in land forces, right? There is, what would have been the need otherwise to change the equipment. And still, most of warfare was about land warfare in the first place. The naval one was just accessory, but not only. Still, here we're talking about large, pitched battles properly fought and won by Iphicrates, and so his fame, the one of his family from there on was so high because of this success. And so it's obvious that these anecdotes overlap with that Iphicratean success by itself on land, major land engagements. Then Nepos goes on, says, Iphicrates changed the type of cuirass, giving them a linen one rather than a bronze one, or a coat of mail, by the way. This is also interesting. This way, he made soldiers more active, and albeit he diminished the weight of their armor, he managed to protect them in an adequate way without overloading them. Which again, if you understand what this is, it's a bit like the Macedonian phalanx, at least as far as the equipment is concerned. You increase the distance with the enemy by normally fighting with a longer length, and so you can afford to get lighter in defense, in body armor. Why would this happen? Because what you could save in that sense was invested in collective training, and collective training was larger and more systemic. And so what it means is that it's not that these people wouldn't actually go into hand-to-hand combat or wouldn't be challenged by that, but let's say it was what the broader formation was able to do, that here we don't see, that we can measure in theory, knowing what this factually mirrors, to systematize the engagement better, so that you would be, let's say, more reliant on maneuvering, on the speed of it, on the order of it, in order to crush the enemy, rather than needing that dramatic bloodbath and prolonged hand-to-hand fighting that was there more traditionally. When weapons were shorter, when there was greater body armor equipment, because up to that point there hadn't been enough collective training to manage to defeat the enemy in conditions that wouldn't even make you need to have prolonged melee. Look again, the oblique order, what the Thebans had done thanks to the size and that increased collective effort against the Spartans. So basically beating them over time before they could deploy. Right? It was not because they had a different type of equipment. That was just fitting that tactic. And that's, in fact, what most people do not understand, because they're obsessed by technology, and so they think it's, they won because they had a different equipment. It has nothing to do with that. That's a consequence, not a cause. Largely, it has nothing to do with that, per se. If you don't have the collective capacity, if you're not a civilization that can afford that, with more central structures, with more resources, with more collective training, you lose. And so it doesn't matter how much of a warrior you are, you get ass kicked. And that's, of course, what happened with the Spartans as well. By the way, we made a video about the Spartans in this regard, that before the loss of their independence, still maintained, were capable in the last period of their, in fact, independence, to actually reform their army in a much more I suspect, more successfully than any other Greek, towards the Macedonian model. Including, the Sarisophoroi, probably the Macedonian phalanx type, better than the Athenians, better than the Thebans. And then, however, they were too much of a, too small of a power there to do anything in the first place. But still, right, even against a bit Spartan traditionalism, and perhaps because of Spartan traditionalism that had over-relied over itself at the point that it got defeated by these newcomers that didn't even have much of a military tradition historically, made them realize more evidently what was the gap that had formed between them and the other Greeks, and so to push forward with still their own strategic culture to change things towards the right direction. And that's actually a very good lesson. So keep it in mind. Warriors are inferior to soldiers, and they're two completely different things. Diodorus Siculus says, from what it's told, after having acquired a long experience in the military operations of the Persian War, other very important things, how do you get that command capacity and, idea of how to make things work? Because you have to go through a real war where pressure is real. This is not anecdotal. It's something abroad. It's not fought in the regular traditional hoplite style. It shows a lot of things that still, with hoplites that fought there, brought them to be transformed in a different fashion. like the one, in fact, Iphicrates found. In fact, Diodorus says Iphicrates found out many different improvements in the instruments of war, dedicating himself especially to matters of weapons. Okay, in the first place, the Greeks used large and thus difficult to handle shields, and Iphicrates rejected them, making other small and oval ones of modest dimensions, reaching thus two objectives: conferring to the body an adequate cover and allowing to the user of this small shield, in virtue of its lightness, to be completely free in movement. Which is important if you pair it, by the way, to the longer lengths, right? But also, as we've seen, to these other needs that could present themselves. That is to say, the hoplite might have needed to get into hand-to-hand combat that, normally the hoplite per se as an amateur wasn't quite very eager or capable of doing. Now, these people were also trained for that, because in warfare you don't fight just as a hoplite. You can find yourself with all these cavalry and skirmishers and difficult grounds, a situation where you may not even be able to order a phalanx, and therefore you have to fight in different ways. And this, again, had always existed actually in hoplitic warfare, but just now it would become more general, more frequent it was more frequent to encounter as a situation in the first place. Then Diodorus says, after a period of trial of the new shield, its ease in the use, its facility in using it, imposed its own adoption, and the infantry that was previously called hoplitae, because of their heavy shield, the oplon, from there on had their name changed into peltasts, from the light pelta that they bore. So again, this has nothing to do with the peltasts as skirmishers. These are heavy infantrymen. It's another thing, right? So do not confuse. Learn what Greeks called their troops like, because they called them on the base of their shields, which doesn't mean that a shield doesn't make tactics, right? A shield fits to tactics. It's another thing. That's how technology works. It fits tactics, not the other way around. Or if it does, it's by a minimal percentage. And relatively to the spears and the swords, Iphicrates, Diodorus says, made a change in the opposite direction. The factor he increased the length of the spears of a half, and he doubled the length of the swords. The practical usage of these arms confirmed the initial proofs, and from the success of the experiment, Iphicrates gained great fame of general, of genius and ingenuity. And he created also some soldiers' boots, easy to untie and light, that continue up to our own days to be called Iphicrateans. This is another thing he was credited, but even, again, it's like Marius that says that, tradition says, he made the legionnaires bring in the shield in their back and not in their side because they banged it against their knees. Yes, because, the Romans had to wait hundreds of years to march everywhere, without banging with their shield against their knees against the shields. I mean, you understand how, always consider that this mechanicism and technologism is typical also of Hellenic influence historiography, because it gets down, as you understand these, especially from Diodorus, this attention just to the technique, to the weapons per se, right? None of these explain actually what tactics were successful for, right, in a broader formation. It just makes you see, just because they changed the weapon, is but how did they fight? Unfortunately, they don't not tell, but we can grasp that because of how this situations could be. In fact, this thing of the boots as well, it's obvious that it speaks of the need to fight on a more disconnected terrain. on with a soldier that had to also kind of jump around, not just to be stuck into a fixed phalanx without going anywhere, doing anything, right? So something much more, there's an increased agility in this troop. Finally, Iphicrates introduced also other useful improvements in the art of war, but it would be boring to write about them. So thanks, Diodorus, right? You think we would be bored. No, we would have liked to know, but you deem it to be boring, and so yes, you're telling us that you're a Greek and you reason like this, and it's fine. We're thankful for this too, because that tells a lot more than maybe just these other aspects in the way in the moment in which you don't want to talk about them, about your mentality, and thus also part of this military culture. And this is interesting because it speaks properly of the art of war, so not generally just the weapons, right? And it's interesting how he framed the thing, because he says that Iphicrates, dedicated himself especially in matters of arms, as if these were the things to change. They wouldn't change for that. There was obviously something else from the practice that was being pioneered there, so much that even the proximity to Philip II of Macedon, Iphicrates won an enormous reputation in this, and the Macedonians also were around in that sense. Actually, makes it can be interpreted properly as a seed of for what the Macedonian tactics would have eventually turned into, which again is something completely different, because that operates in a context of combined arms, whereas the Iphicratean hoplites are still properly hoplites in an hoplitic tactic, right? That relies fundamentally just on the hoplite, even though it's flanked by other troops. This complement is not always to be, let's say, the centrality of the phalanx is always there. Those are kind of supportive troops, whereas with Macedonian tactics you have cavalry and infantry, and you can't have one without the other, right? So something completely different that here the Greeks nor Iphicrates had hinted at, obtaining or achieving and thinking. It's something completely different. It could have happened at that point just in Macedon because of the particular political and social conditions, and also other contingencies, such as the Thracian precious stones after the Macedonian conquest of the region, that were rendered available for levying an army of professionals. So you see how making things easier is never quite of a sensible option. But it's important to look properly at this type of trooper. That here, by the way, I created, as you can see here, this is my drawing. And so I am, because you should know that I'm an artist, right? And as such, I should be revered and appreciated. And you can see here that I showed what, say, a standard Iphicratean hoplite could be around, actually 375 BC, let's put it in this way. And of course it's because this video is a military unit type, so that's why we will talk about tactics and more comprehensively and in another video, and about the Iphicratean reform, etc. more specifically. But here we look mostly at the equipment of it, that as you understand, the sources stress in a rather specific way, as we've just seen. Here I used a Ionian helmet with some coloring, and there could be of different types. The cheek pieces also are hinged to the helmet, can be swung upwards. That's maybe another type of you see the boots that were easy to take off, etc. These were other mechanisms that could be maybe were enhanced at that time because of this need of flexibility, and or because warfare was becoming ever more in fact, changing, ever more needing this kind of ease, right? Not just brutal force, but just a greater dosage of on the longer run of energies, etc. So even these small things could make the difference. You wouldn't believe, probably. We have seen here, you can see actually very well the sword, but if you look on the guy's left side, you can see a scabbard, and that was the tip of the sword. And so this was considerably long as well. The considered that doubling a sword is really a lot. Really, it's really a big leap forward in terms of sword usage and training, etc. It's not the smaller sword. I mean, before that, also if you look at more archaic times, frankly, were sometimes also remarkable swords, but not just particularly small ones. So they don't have to underestimate the need also in this battle, and the needs of slashing in a more open space with lines that could be more open than before. And so again, suggesting that there were different modes these troopers were suited to fighting in, because again, the increasing discipline and increasing professionalism brings necessarily to be able to fight in different tactical situations. So we don't have to see, of course, the lengthening of the spear as necessarily, just in pair at the same time in combat with the need of using a longer sword. If anything, it's the contrary, right? So much that even the Macedonian hoplites later on wouldn't have such large swords in the same way. Why? Because as we were saying before, here the hoplites were in theory doing everything, right? Whereas in Macedonian tactics, the collective element surpassed by far the need of a prolonged hand-to-hand combat of the phalanges, whereas it was about the combination of cavalry and infantry made the difference. Not again that they wouldn't fight in hand-to-hand, they did. Even the probably we have underestimated even the Macedonian phalangitic capacity of passing to the swords. Think about that. There are some. Think about the Upas Pistae that we don't even understand that were properly a professional, an elite unit, that whether they would fight in the phalanx or as commando troops or even fighting individually, because they could be effectively both. And it's a bit here what the phalangite was probably, that the hoplite was becoming for a military system that still, however, was based on the phalanx as like there could be other troops around it, but they weren't really cooperating synergically like in the Macedonian tactic. So the need of knowing how to fight in a compact formation with all these longer lances and presenting this spear wall, let's say, and the need instead in other situations to pass to the sword in a more individual fight were proper in fact of two different tactical situations, right? This guy ideally could engage against kind of some barbarian mercenary, but that was more habituated to individual combat, because this Iphicratean hoplite would know how to wield a quite considerable sword even in that fashion. So there are two separated moments. It means that the hoplite is just even out there for a longer time on campaign, and so more things can happen to him and necessarily has to know how to cope with them, right? This is the real change. It's not a static tactic that is just crystallized in a way that can never change, and so you have to make fit these weapons in a way that is just for one single use. No, it could be for multiple uses in different times. That's the point of professionalism as such, right? It's like, I don't know, the Roman legionnaires. They didn't all fight like heavy infantrymen. Some of them were lightly equipped and could in assault operations, in other things, like they could even leave their armor. So this is a bit what is happening here, of course. The lightening, the mobilization of the hoplite from its traditional heavier forms. So we have seen essentially a 13-14 feet spear. Now, albeit even about this aspect, should we think that all now the Athenian hoplites, or even just in an Iphicratean army proper commanded by him, all the hoplites had this a spear this length and nothing else, and there wouldn't be other, units that were still fighting the old way? Who said that, right? We don't know, right? Surely there was some standardization as far as the collective use entailed, right? But still, there could be other bodies of this kind. What we understand here is that the prevalent use of the spear also would have continued to be with one hand only, even though hoplites could do everything, could still use both hands, already used both hands, but this could be also in the past as well. Overarm, underarm, those are also overly emphasized, unnecessarily overly emphasized problems. How did hoplites fought? Underarm, overarm, of course they fought in both ways. Again, all those people that have to explain technically, because they've taken a spear in their hand, they've been with a bunch of guys that tell you, because we tried this. Yes, you tried what it meant to be a 4th century hoplite. Yes, you must be so reliable and so insightful and full of understanding that nobody has, right? You really know better. Troops used weapons in the most radically diverse ways every single damn time you can think they needed it, and any other consideration is bullshit. What we see maybe from iconography, but we're not sure even about this, is that probably the pelta was not affixed to the arm in the same manner as would become later the Macedonian shield, that still had to contemplate instead bringing the much longer, not much longer, but the longer and heavier and also kind of very specific type of sarissa in with both hands, right? So, as we were saying before, the extent to which hoplites so armed replaced normal hoplites is unknown, right? And some people say it was not even great. And maybe they're right, because at the end of the day, these are types of troops that were being pioneered, first of all, in a time that here in the space of some... I would be prone, it depends, right? One should look in detail at the greater Atlantic, military landscape, and unfortunately we lack so much information that we can't know. It's possible that in some generations, the military changes could have been generalized, but the idea is still that both ways surely existed. They continued existing, by the way, because, yes, the Macedonians at some point take over, but the Greeks remain fundamentally autonomous. They had their own armies, and so we don't know how much traditional hoplitism continued to be, nor how much the Iphicratean hoplite type remained, right? So it seems, by the way, that Athens, paradoxically, was some of the most conservative systems in the later Hellenic era, like before they were taken over by foreign nations. So it really depends. We don't know, but the idea is still that these were bodies of hoplites, at least with a certain degree of professionalism. Makes us say, first of all, some of these were mercenaries, so were not even properly part of the Athenian military per se. Secondly, the Athenian military per se didn't need that kind of systematized professionalism. It's very hard to think that it could be achieved. What for exactly? I mean, it's not even impossible there could have been a talk about the standardization, right? This could have even been achieved. It's not implausible in absolute terms. But again, here we don't have to think about rigidly, structured military organizations for which, that guy had arrived, had changed equipment, so from there on everything changed according to him. That was based mostly on practice, and practice was ever more a mercenary, that is, foreign thing. The Hellenic city-states had their own armies, they made their own experiments, but at the same time we're not the same guys, that served abroad on a regular basis like many hoplitic mercenaries would do, right? That was not generalized, standardized. We don't have a proof of that. Nor the Iphicratean system actually speaks of a full professionalism per se, right? So the degree by which these two, let's say the amateur and the professional, were mixed is unknown, and we don't have any proof of a fully professional military system in Greece, so which answered the questions. No, if anything, it wasn't something uniform, nor in Athens, nor in any other polis that we can look at. Only the Macedonians would go fully professional for the first time in the Hellenic culture, let's say. But so it's this factotum hoplite that has enough collective training to use a longer length information, and that has enough individual training for wielding an important sword that's in one-to-one combat. Let's say, surely it's something you don't find as a generalized hoplitic type anywhere that I'm aware in Hellenic history. Not, of course, before it wasn't the case, afterwards also neither. And still stressing that we're talking about hoplitic tactics per se, which means that we're talking even just about a very narrow part of the same Hellenic world doing this. And again, you can find a hoplite in the guise of somebody who literally has a hoplitic equipment fighting in a completely different way from the way a hoplite in the Hellenic motherland would do, right? Also, the Romans had hoplitic equipment, but they never used, ever, historically, any kind of hoplitic tactics, because simply nobody else fought like that. And that's today we know that the hoplitic system didn't go out of the motherland, that nobody fought like these specific systems were, because they were so peculiar that nobody else had the political social reason to fight like them. But being equipped as a hoplite doesn't make you fight like that, and actually doesn't even make you fight worse than that, because other peoples, as a matter of fact, were much more warlike, and they had quite more of a greater aptitude to war than the Greeks, that somewhat consider such lifestyle, in fact, barbaric by definition. So again, surely in Athens this thing never became prevalent. And I think it's interesting to look at these aspects of Hellenic warfare, and we will keep talking about them. For now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.